Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was living in a third-floor apartment with several roommates. I know Halloween makes the whole story sound almost too perfect, like something invented to fit the date, but that is honestly when it happened. Nothing unusual had been planned. There was no party in our apartment, no haunted house decoration, and no one trying to scare anyone. It was just another night, except for the costumes, distant voices, and people moving through the neighborhood later than usual. I had been out for part of the evening and returned to the apartment alone. Before I even reached the building, I heard my cat. He was screaming from inside. We lived on the third floor, but his cries were loud enough that I could hear them from outside before I had even entered the building. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Cats can make strange sounds, especially at night. There could have been another cat somewhere nearby, fighting, trapped, or calling from an open window. Then I recognized his voice. It was definitely my cat. He was not making an ordinary meow. He sounded terrified. The noise was long, sharp, and desperate, almost like an animal being attacked. He would scream, pause briefly, and then start again. The sound echoed from above while I stood near the entrance. I immediately became worried that he had hurt himself. Maybe he had knocked something over, become trapped behind furniture, or caught part of his body somewhere. I also wondered whether someone had broken into the apartment. If a stranger was inside, my cat might have reacted with fear. I hurried through the entrance and started climbing the stairs. The closer I got to the third floor, the louder he became. His cries filled the stairwell. I could hear him moving around behind the apartment door, his claws scratching against the floor as he ran from one place to another. I called his name through the door. He did not calm down. If anything, his screaming became louder. By then, my heart was racing. I tried the key quickly, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. The moment there was enough space, my cat shot past me. He did not stop to greet me. He did not hesitate or look up. He bolted through the doorway and ran down the stairs as fast as he could, still screaming. I stood there in shock for half a second before going after him. He had never done anything like that before. He was an indoor cat and normally showed no interest in escaping into the building. Even if the door opened unexpectedly, he usually stayed inside or approached it carefully. He was familiar with the apartment and treated it as his safe place. That night, he ran from it, as if something inside was trying to kill him. The way he screamed was almost beyond what I thought a cat could produce. It sounded as though he had seen some giant monster waiting in the rooms behind me. Something so unnatural that every instinct in his body told him to get as far away as possible. He raced down the stairwell while I followed, calling his name. I found him lower in the building, pressed near a wall or corner, still panicking. His eyes were wide, his ears were flattened, and his whole body was tense. I bent down to pick him up. The moment I touched him, he fought me. He screamed, twisted, and clawed at my arms as if I were carrying him back toward a cage. He was not angry with me. He was trying to escape because he knew I intended to take him upstairs again. I held him as carefully as I could while he struggled. He dug his claws into me and kept turning his head toward the upper floors. His body felt rigid in my arms. I could feel his heart beating quickly beneath his fur. I tried speaking calmly. I told him everything was okay. I said his name and held him close. but he did not believe me. When I started climbing the stairs, his panic became worse. He twisted so violently that I nearly dropped him. It felt like trying to carry an animal toward a burning building. Every part of him wanted to get away from the apartment. For a moment, I considered leaving him somewhere downstairs while I checked the rooms, but I could not allow him to wander through the building or escape outside. It was Halloween night, people were coming and going, and someone might accidentally let him out. So I carried him back. When we reached the 3rd floor, he began screaming again. The apartment door was still open, exactly as I had left it. From the hallway, I could see part of the living area. Nothing obvious looked wrong. No person stood inside. No furniture had been overturned. There were no broken windows or signs of forced entry. I stepped through the doorway, with the cat still fighting in my arms. As soon as I put him down, he moved away from the deeper parts of the apartment. He stayed close to the entrance, or tried to hide somewhere that gave him a view of the rooms. He was shaking. I had seen cats become frightened by vacuum cleaners, loud noises, dogs, and unfamiliar people. This was different. He did not calm down after realizing I was home. His entire body continued trembling. He stared toward the hall and rooms beyond the main area, as if expecting something to appear. That reaction began frightening me. I was the only person home. My roommates were still out, including the girls who shared one of the bedrooms. The apartment should have been completely empty, except for my cat. I closed and locked the front door. Then I stood quietly and listened. At first, I heard nothing unusual. The building produced its normal sounds. People moved on the stairs outside. Somewhere below us, a door opened and closed. Voices from the street drifted upward. Inside the apartment, everything was still. I checked the living room first. The furniture looked normal. No one was behind the couch or curtains. The windows were closed, and nothing seemed damaged. I looked in the kitchen. No cabinets were open. Nothing had fallen. There was no animal, person, or object that could explain the cat's behavior. I checked the bathrooms, closets, and the areas beneath furniture. I opened doors carefully, half expecting someone to jump out. No one did. The apartment was not large enough for a person to hide easily, but I still searched every space I could think of. I checked behind the shower curtain. I looked under beds. I opened closets and moved hanging clothes aside. Nothing was there. I tried to think of an ordinary explanation. Maybe another animal had gotten inside. A mouse or insect could have frightened the cat, though his reaction seemed far too extreme. If there had been a bird, bat, or larger animal in the apartment, I should have found some sign of it. Maybe a loud sound had scared him just before I arrived. Something could have fallen in another apartment, causing vibrations through the walls or floor. The noise might have stopped by the time I came inside. But he continued staring toward the rooms. He did not behave like an animal recovering from a sudden sound. He acted as if the source was still present. I walked from room to room again. My cat followed only part of the way. He refused to move near certain areas and remained tense whenever I approached the hallway. I looked around for anything that had changed since I left. Nothing seemed out of place. The apartment felt completely normal, which somehow made the situation worse. If I had found a broken object or trapped animal, I could have explained everything. Instead, there was only a terrified cat and an empty home. Time passed while I searched. Eventually, the cat became slightly quieter, though he never fully relaxed. He stayed close to me or watched the apartment from a safe position. By the time I stopped investigating, it was around midnight. I was exhausted. I had been frightened at first, but after checking the apartment several times, I began feeling foolish. Halloween probably made the whole situation seem more dramatic than it really was. There had to be a normal explanation I had missed. Maybe the cat had seen a shadow through the window. Perhaps someone in costume passed outside or appeared briefly in the hallway. Cats can react strongly to smells, sounds, and movement humans do not notice. I told myself he would calm down eventually. My roommates had not returned yet, and I did not know exactly when they would be home. I was tired enough that I wanted to shower and go to bed. Before entering the bathroom, I checked the front door again to make sure it was locked. The apartment remained quiet. My cat still looked nervous, but he was no longer screaming. I went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. The water and fan covered most of the sounds from the rest of the apartment. Steam began filling the room, and for the first time since arriving home, I started relaxing. I was still thinking about the cat's reaction. I wondered whether I should tell my roommates when they came back. They would probably laugh and say he had been frightened by Halloween decorations or people outside. Part of me already felt embarrassed for searching every room like an intruder might be hiding there. While I was showering, my roommates returned. I did not hear them enter immediately because of the water. They came upstairs together, talking normally, but became frightened before they reached the apartment. From outside the building or near the lower stairs, they could see our apartment windows. The lights were on in their bedroom. That alone was not impossible. They assumed someone else was home. Maybe I had entered their room, or another roommate had returned before them. Then they realized something that made them stop. The two girls who lived in that bedroom were both outside, coming home together. No one should have been inside their room. From the exterior, they could clearly see light shining from their window. They continued up the stairs, now nervous. The closer they came to the apartment, the less sense it made. They knew I might be home, but I had no reason to go into their room and switch on the lights. When they reached the door, they unlocked it and entered. They could hear the shower running, which told them I was in the bathroom. The apartment was otherwise quiet. Then they looked toward their bedroom. The lights were off. The room that had appeared brightly lit from outside was now dark. They started calling for me. Their voices sounded frightened enough that I turned off the water and asked what was wrong. They explained that they had seen the lights on in their bedroom while approaching the building. They were certain about it. Both of them had noticed. But by the time they came through the apartment door, the lights were off. I had not touched them. I told them I had been the only person inside. Before showering, I had searched the entire apartment because of the cat. No one had been hiding there. The girls went into their bedroom and checked everything. Nothing had been disturbed. Their belongings were where they had left them. The windows were closed, and there was no sign that anyone had entered. They tested the light switch. It worked normally. The bulbs did not flicker or turn on by themselves while we watched. One possible explanation was that they had seen a reflection in the window. Halloween lights, headlights, or another apartment's lighting could have created the appearance that their room was illuminated. But both of them believed the light came from inside. They knew what their bedroom window looked like when the light was on. They had seen it many times from outside. It was not a quick flash or uncertain glow. The whole room appeared lit. Then, somewhere between their view from outside and opening the apartment door, the light switched off. That was when I told them what had happened with the cat. I explained that I heard him screaming from outside the building. I told them how he bolted through the door and ran down the stairs the moment I opened it. I showed them the scratches on my arms from carrying him back. I described the way he shook and stared toward the apartment as though something was still inside. The roommates became even more frightened. Until then, they may have believed someone had accidentally entered their room or that the light switch had some electrical problem. Hearing that the cat had acted terrified before I arrived made the events feel connected. We checked the apartment again, this time together. We searched every room, closet, and corner. The front door had been locked while I showered. No one could have entered without using a key, and we would probably have heard the door. The windows were high above the ground on the third floor. A stranger could not easily climb inside. There was nowhere for someone to hide and then leave without passing us. We found nothing. My cat remained nervous around the room and hallway. He watched us move through the apartment, but avoided going near certain spaces. One of my roommates tried calling him. Usually, he would respond or walk toward familiar people. That night, he stayed low and alert. We began considering whether the light had somehow turned itself on and off. Electrical problems can cause strange behavior. A loose wire might make a bulb flicker, and someone outside could mistake the brief light for a fully illuminated room. But the roommates had seen it steadily enough to notice and discuss it while approaching. Also, neither of them had left the light on earlier. They both remembered turning it off before leaving. I had not entered the room. There was no timer or smart system controlling it. The switch needed to be physically moved. We checked whether the switch felt loose. It did not. Another explanation was that someone had been inside before I arrived. Perhaps a person entered the apartment, frightened the cat, and hid when they heard me coming. While I searched, they could have moved between rooms and eventually escaped. But I had checked the doors and windows. The front door was the only easy exit. If someone had left while I showered, my roommates would likely have met them on the stairs or seen the apartment door open. There was also no reason for an intruder to switch on the bedroom light and then turn it off before leaving. Nothing had been stolen. No belongings were moved. The thought of a real person hiding in the apartment was frightening, but it did not fit. The supernatural explanation was not much better. Halloween night naturally made us think about ghosts, but I did not want to believe that something had been inside the apartment. I tried to joke about it. Maybe the cat had seen a ghost. Maybe it turned on the lights because it was looking for something. The joke did not make anyone feel better. We kept more lights on than usual that night. No one wanted to sleep alone immediately. The girls stayed together in their room, though they checked the window and light switch several times before closing the door. I stayed with my cat. He eventually settled down, but he did not behave completely normally. He remained close to me and lifted his head whenever the apartment made a sound. I barely slept. Every time I heard movement, I wondered whether someone was walking through the rooms. I expected a light to switch on. Nothing else happened that night. By morning, the apartment felt ordinary again. Sunlight entered through the windows, and the rooms looked too small and familiar to contain anything frightening. The cat acted more like himself. He ate, moved around, and no longer screamed when approaching the hallway. The girls checked their bedroom and found everything exactly as it should have been. During the day, it was easy to believe the whole event had been a combination of unrelated things. The cat may have been frightened by an animal, noise, or smell. The roommates may have mistaken a reflection for their light. Halloween may have caused all of us to connect the events and imagine something supernatural. That is the reasonable explanation. But some details continue bothering me. My cat had never tried to escape like that before. He did not simply run outside because he was curious. He forced his way past me while screaming, raced down several flights of stairs, and fought desperately when I carried him back. He acted as though the apartment itself was dangerous. He began panicking before I entered, which meant something had frightened him while he was completely alone. I searched and found nothing. Then, while I was unable to see or hear the rest of the apartment, my roommates saw their bedroom lights on. The room belonged to the two people standing outside. No one should have been inside. By the time they entered, the lights were off. I had not touched the switch. The timing is what makes the story feel impossible. Whatever frightened the cat may have been in the apartment before I arrived. It remained hidden while I searched. Then, after I went into the shower, it entered the girls' room and turned on the light. When it realized they were returning, it switched the light off. That sounds like a story created to frighten people, but it matches the order of events. The cat reacted first, then the light. I sometimes wonder what he saw. Animals notice things humans miss. He may have heard movement inside the walls or smelled another animal. Perhaps a large insect, rodent, or bat entered and escaped before I searched. But his reaction seemed personal. He stared toward the rooms as if something was moving there. When I carried him back, he fought like I was returning him to danger. Maybe he saw a person. Maybe he saw something standing in the girls' bedroom. Perhaps that was why the light appeared there later. We never experienced anything exactly like it again. There were normal apartment noises, lights burned out, and the cat occasionally became frightened by things we could identify. But he never again screamed loudly enough for me to hear him from outside the building. He never again ran down the stairs the moment the door opened. The bedroom light never appeared on when everyone was away. That should make the event easier to dismiss. Instead, it makes it feel like something passed through our home for only one night. Perhaps Halloween had nothing to do with it. Maybe the date was simply a coincidence. But I cannot deny that it added to the feeling. While people outside wore costumes and pretended to be monsters, something inside our apartment terrified an animal that had always felt safe there. It left no mark. It stole nothing. It did not show itself to any of us. It only made the cat scream and switched on a light in an empty room. Sometimes I think the light was meant to be seen from outside. The roommates were approaching the building at exactly the right moment. If they had returned a few minutes earlier or later, they might never have noticed it. Something illuminated their room while they were still outside, almost as if it wanted them to know someone was home. Then, before they entered, the light went out. Maybe it was only faulty wiring. Maybe a car's headlights reflected strangely. Maybe the cat heard a loud noise and panicked. Those explanations are possible. I hope one of them is correct. But whenever I remember that night, I see my cat pushing past my legs and racing down the stairwell. I remember the way he screamed when I picked him up. He did not want to return. He knew something was inside. And while I stood beneath the shower, unable to hear the apartment around me, my roommates looked up at the third floor and saw a light burning in a bedroom where no living person could have been. When I was 8 years old, back in 1999, I saw something in the sky that I still cannot explain. It happened in southeast Missouri while my mother and I were driving along Highway 49 on the way to my grandmother's house. I was sitting in the back seat, looking out the window, probably bored in the way children often become during familiar drives. We had made that trip before, and nothing about the day seemed unusual when we started. The road, the trees, and the fields were all part of a landscape I already knew. There was one section of the drive where the road came out of the tree line and opened into a long, straight stretch. It continued for about a mile without any major turns. On both sides of the road were large open fields, probably 400 or 500 feet wide before the trees began again in the distance. Because the land was so open, you could see much farther there than you could along most of the highway. For a child in the back seat, it was one of the less interesting parts of the journey. There were no houses close to the road, no stores, and not much traffic. It was mainly grass, sky, and the dark line of trees far across the fields. I was looking out the window on my left when I noticed something floating over the field. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. It was a silver object shaped like a saucer. It hung about 150 feet above the field, although that is only my best estimate. I was 8 years old and had no way to measure the height. It was low enough that it did not look like a distant airplane, but high enough that it was clearly above the ground and not attached to anything. The object was completely still. There was no visible movement, no turning, and no slow drifting in the wind. It simply remained in one place above the field while our car moved along the road. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to identify it. It did not look like an airplane. There were no wings, tail, or visible engines. It did not look like a helicopter either. There were no blades spinning above it, and I could not hear the heavy beating sound a helicopter would make at that distance. It was shaped like the kind of flying saucer people draw in cartoons, although it was not as exaggerated. It looked metallic and solid, with a silver surface that reflected the daylight. The body was rounded and somewhat flat, but it was not completely thin like the edge of a plate or a sharp blade. The center had some thickness to it. Around the outer edge was a darker rim. At the time, I could not tell whether that section was painted a darker color, made from a different material, or simply covered in shadow because of the angle of the light. The distance also made the size difficult to judge. It did not appear enormous. My best guess now is that it may have been around 30 feet across, although it could have been somewhat larger or smaller. It was definitely large enough that it could not have been a normal toy or something attached to a balloon. For a moment, I watched without feeling afraid. Children see strange things and often assume there is a simple answer. I thought maybe it was some kind of aircraft I had never seen before. Perhaps it was a weather balloon, a small blimp, or something connected to farming. But it was too still. Even a balloon would have moved slightly in the air. I leaned forward and pointed toward the window. I told my mother to look. At first, she may not have understood what I meant. She was driving and had to keep her eyes on the road. I pointed again and told her there was something above the field. She looked to the left. The moment she saw it, her whole reaction changed. She stared in disbelief. I remember the expression on her face and the sudden fear in her voice. She did not laugh or tell me I had mistaken a plane for something else. She did not ignore it or treat it like a child's imagination. She saw the same thing. For a second, she seemed unable to understand what she was looking at. Then, she panicked. My mother pressed down on the gas pedal. The car began picking up speed. I felt the engine pull harder as we moved faster along the straight road. I looked back toward the field, expecting the silver object to remain behind us. Instead, it began following the car. The craft kept the same general altitude over the field. It did not fly directly above the road or move close to us at first. It remained off to our left, staying over the open land. But it matched our speed. That was what frightened me. As my mother accelerated, the object moved along with us. It kept almost the exact same distance from the car, which allowed me to continue watching it through the same side window. If the object had remained still in the sky, it would have quickly moved behind us from my point of view. I would have needed to turn around and look through the rear window. That did not happen. It stayed beside us. For the entire encounter, which probably lasted about a minute, I could watch it without changing seats or turning around. It moved parallel to the highway, keeping pace with the car while floating over the field. It did not tilt forward like an airplane gaining speed. It did not seem to push air or create any visible disturbance in the grass beneath it. It simply moved. There was no smoke, trail, or exhaust behind it. My mother drove faster. I could tell she wanted to reach the tree line at the end of the straight section. Perhaps she believed that once the road entered the woods again, the object would lose sight of us or stop following. Neither of us said much. I kept watching the saucer. My mother kept glancing between the road and the field. I could feel her fear, even though she was trying to stay in control of the car. The object did not appear to struggle to keep up. No matter how much speed we gained, it remained level with us. Its movement was smooth and perfectly controlled. It felt less like a vehicle chasing us, and more like something studying us. At 8 years old, I did not understand what UFO sightings were supposed to feel like. I knew about flying saucers from movies and television, but those things belonged to stories. They were not supposed to appear beside a real highway in the middle of Missouri. I remember looking at the dark rim around the craft. The rest of the saucer was bright silver, but the edge remained darker as it moved. I tried to decide whether I was looking at a shadow created by the shape of the object. Then another thought entered my mind. What if the dark section was made of windows? The idea frightened me immediately. If they were windows, then something could have been inside. Something might have been watching us from the other side. The craft continued pacing the car as the end of the open stretch approached. Ahead of us, the road climbed a small hill before entering the tree line again. The trees on both sides became closer to the highway, and the open view of the field was about to disappear. I remember believing we only needed to reach that hill. Once we were back beneath the cover of the trees, maybe the object would stop following. The saucer remained beside us. It seemed calm. It had not approached closer or made any threatening movement. It only matched our speed, holding its place in the sky with impossible precision. That almost made it worse. It felt as if it was playing with us. Our car was moving as fast as my mother felt safe driving, yet the craft stayed beside us without effort. It could have moved faster at any moment, but it chose not to. Then, just before we reached the hill, it changed speed. The movement was so sudden that I could barely follow it. The object accelerated faster than anything I had ever seen. There was no gradual increase. One moment, it was floating beside us over the field. The next, it shot forward. It passed over our car. I remember looking upward and trying to keep it in sight through the window. It moved across the road in a straight line, going from the left side of the highway to the right. For a moment, it was directly above us or slightly ahead. Then it crossed over and continued toward the trees on the other side. The speed was unbelievable. It did not make a wide turn like an airplane. It did not bank, slow down, or change altitude in any way I could see. It made a clean, straight movement over the road. Then I lost sight of it against the tree line. It was gone. I pressed closer to the window and tried to see where it had gone. The silver surface should have stood out against the dark trees, but I could not find it. The road climbed the small hill and entered the woods again. The open fields disappeared behind us. For the rest of the drive, the car was almost completely silent. My mother did not explain what we had seen. She did not tell me it was an airplane, balloon, or trick of the light. She seemed to be trying to understand it herself. I watched her from the back seat. Her hands remained tight on the steering wheel, and she stared straight ahead. I could tell she was replaying the encounter in her mind. I was doing the same thing. The entire event lasted only around a minute, but it felt much longer. I kept expecting the saucer to appear again above the trees or behind the car. Every time we passed another opening in the woods, I looked for a flash of silver in the sky. I saw nothing. We continued to my grandmother's house without another incident. I do not clearly remember who we told first or exactly what my mother said afterward. The memory of the sighting itself is much stronger than the conversations that followed. I know that I never forgot the object. Some childhood memories become unclear over time. Faces change, places blend together, and details disappear. This one has remained unusually sharp. I remember the road. I remember the long open stretch. I remember the fields on both sides. I remember sitting in the back seat, and looking through the left window. I remember the silver saucer floating above the grass. I remember my mother's face when she saw it. Most of all, I remember it following us. Over the years, I have tried to think of normal explanations. The first possibility is that it was some kind of aircraft. A small plane could have flown parallel to the road, and distance might have made it look like a saucer. If we saw it from the side or at a strange angle, the wings may have been difficult to identify. But a plane could not remain perfectly still in the air before following us. It would also have needed to turn or bank when crossing the highway. The object did neither. A helicopter can hover and move sideways. That explanation works slightly better. A helicopter could remain above a field and then match the speed of a car. It could also cross over the road, but the object had no visible rotor, tail, or cockpit. It made no sound that I remember. A helicopter flying only 150 feet above a nearby field would have been extremely loud. My mother and I would have heard the blades and engine even with the car windows closed. There was only silence. Another possibility is that it was a weather balloon. A balloon can appear silver and round, and its shape can seem strange from a distance. But balloons move with the wind. They cannot remain perfectly still and then follow a car at highway speed. They also cannot suddenly accelerate over the road in a straight line. It could have been a blimp, although it was far too small, and did not have the long shape, fins, or hanging cabin of one. A drone might explain some of the movement today, but this happened in 1999. Small civilian drones capable of hovering and moving quickly were not common then, especially not 30-foot wide ones flying over rural Missouri. There were remote-controlled aircraft, but none I knew of could behave like what we saw. Some people might suggest it was a reflection in the car window. Reflections can appear to follow a vehicle because they are created by something inside the car. A light or shiny object could have reflected in the glass and seemed to float over the field. But my mother saw it from the front seat, while I saw it from the back. We were looking from different positions and angles. A single reflection would not have appeared in the same place for both of us. The object also crossed above the car and disappeared toward the opposite tree line. That movement did not behave like a reflection. It could have been an optical illusion involving a distant object. When a person is moving, something far away can appear to remain beside them. The moon seems to follow a car for the same reason. If the saucer were much farther away than I believed, it might only have seemed to pace us. That explanation works until the final movement. The object shot over our heads. It crossed from one side of the road to the other. My mother reacted to it too. Whatever it was, it did not remain distant. I have also considered whether my childhood memory might have changed over time. I was only 8. Maybe the object was farther away, smaller, or less strange than I now remember. My mother's fear could have influenced the way I understood it. Every time I thought about the encounter, the saucer may have become clearer and more dramatic. Memory is not a perfect recording. It can change without people realizing it. That is possible. Still, the main details have never changed. A silver object hovered above the field. My mother saw it. She accelerated. It followed us. Then it flew over the car at impossible speed. I have never had another experience like it. I have seen planes, helicopters, balloons, meteors, and satellites. None of them looked or moved the same way. The silence of the craft remains one of the strangest details. Something that size moving that quickly should have made noise. Even if it used an unfamiliar engine, I would expect to hear wind, vibration, or some kind of mechanical sound as it passed overhead. I remember nothing. It moved without announcing itself. That makes me wonder whether it was much farther away than I believed. But if it was, the movement over the road would have required even greater speed. There is no explanation that solves every part. The dark rim has stayed in my thoughts more than I expected. As a child, I first assumed it was only a darker part of the metal. Then I wondered whether it was shadow. Later, I began thinking about the possibility of windows. If the rim contained windows, the craft may have had a full view of the area around it. It may have seen the highway, the car, my mother, and me in the back seat. That thought gives me chills. While I was looking up at the saucer, something inside may have been looking back. The object's behavior seemed curious rather than random. It remained above the field until we noticed it. Then, when my mother panicked and increased speed, it moved with us. It kept the exact distance needed for me to continue watching. It waited until we approached the tree line. Then it passed over the car and vanished. If it wanted to harm us, it probably could have done so. It was clearly faster than the car. Instead, it seemed to be observing our reaction. That is why I sometimes feel that it was playing with us. It allowed us to believe we were escaping. Then it demonstrated that it could pass us whenever it wanted. I wonder how long it had been above the field before I noticed it. It may have been there for several minutes. Perhaps it saw our car emerge from the trees and decided to follow. Maybe other drivers saw it that day. Highway 49 was not completely empty, although I do not remember another vehicle being close to us during the encounter. Someone farther down the road might have watched the saucer cross over the highway. There may have been other reports that I never heard about. This happened before most people carried smartphones. Even if my mother had owned a camera, there would not have been time to find it and take a picture while driving. All we could do was watch. That lack of proof has always bothered me. My mother was the only other witness I knew. If I had seen it alone, I might have eventually convinced myself it was imagination. Children misunderstand things all the time. But my mother saw it. Her panic was immediate and real. She did not need me to explain why it was strange. She knew. For the rest of the drive, she was quiet because there was no normal answer she could give me. I sometimes wonder whether she remembers the encounter exactly as I do. I wonder if she thinks about it when driving through open fields or seeing unusual lights in the sky. Perhaps she tries not to discuss it because it frightened her more than it frightened me. As a child, I felt fear, but I also felt curiosity. My mother understood the danger more clearly. She was responsible for protecting us, and she had no control over the object beside the road. Driving faster was the only action available to her. It did not help. The craft followed easily. That must have been terrifying. Years later, whenever I traveled on long rural roads, I watched the sky more carefully. Open fields still remind me of that mile-long stretch in Missouri. Sometimes I see sunlight reflecting from a plane and feel the same sudden tension. I wait for it to stop. I wait for it to match the car. It never does. I do not claim to know that the object came from another planet. The word UFO only means that it was unidentified. It could have been secret military technology, an experimental aircraft, an unusual atmospheric event, or something neither my mother nor I recognized. But whatever it was, it behaved in ways that normal aircraft should not. It hovered without sound. It followed a moving vehicle while maintaining its distance. Then it accelerated over the road so quickly that I lost sight of it almost immediately. I still remember the silver surface. I remember the dark rim. And I remember the thought that formed after the encounter. What if those dark sections were windows? What if something had been sitting inside, staring through them at the small child watching from the back seat? That question has followed me longer than the craft followed our car. I was 8 years old in 1999 riding with my mother through southeast Missouri. We came out of the trees onto a straight stretch of Highway 49. A silver saucer waited above the field. My mother tried to outrun it. It stayed beside us for almost a mile. Then, just before we reached the safety of the trees, it shot over our heads as if it wanted us to understand one final thing. We had never been escaping. It had only been allowing us to believe that we were. When I was babysitting a little girl who was around 3 years old at the time. I had watched her before, so the night was not supposed to be difficult. She was a sweet child, but like most 3-year-olds, she could become restless, loud, or upset when she was tired. My usual way of keeping her calm was putting on one of her favorite movies and letting her sit with me on the couch until her parents came home. That night, we were watching Tangled. It was her favorite movie, and it worked perfectly whenever I needed her to stay quiet. The moment the movie began, she focused completely on the screen. She had her pacifier in her mouth, her eyes fixed on the bright colors and songs, and she seemed happy to sit beside me without causing any trouble. I was on the couch with her, petting the family cat with one hand and texting my friends with the other. The cat was relaxed beside us, stretched out comfortably and enjoying the attention. Everything inside the house felt normal. Outside, however, the weather was terrible. It was raining extremely hard. The rain struck the windows and roof so loudly that it sometimes became difficult to hear the quieter parts of the movie. Wind pushed against the house, and the darkness outside made the windows look like black mirrors. The storm made the entire place feel isolated. Even though we were in a normal neighborhood, the heavy rain made it seem as if the house had been separated from everything around it. I could not hear cars passing or people outside. There was only the rain, the wind, and the television playing in front of us. The house was also darker than I liked. Most of the lights had been turned off because we were watching the movie, and the television provided most of the light in the room. Each change in the scene caused different colors to move across the walls and furniture. During bright parts of the movie, the room seemed comfortable. When the screen became darker, the shadows around us grew deeper. I have always been easily frightened. I was the kind of person who could scare myself simply by thinking too much about an empty hallway or dark doorway. I knew this about myself, so I tried not to let my imagination become too active. I was responsible for a small child, and I did not want her to become nervous because I was afraid of normal house sounds. Still, the storm had already made me uneasy. Every loud strike of rain against the window made me look up. When the wind moved something outside, I wondered whether someone was near the house. The old building made occasional creaks and knocks, though those sounds were probably caused by the weather. The couch was positioned in a way that made me feel especially uncomfortable. Behind me was an open corner of the room. It was not a solid wall directly at my back. There was open space leading toward another part of the house. Depending on where someone stood, they could have approached from behind without immediately entering my view. During the day, I probably would not have cared about the layout. At night, with the room mostly dark and the storm covering smaller sounds, I kept thinking about that empty space behind me. I tried to ignore it. I continued petting the cat and texting my friends while the little girl watched Tangled. The movie's music filled the room, and for a while I began to relax. Then, the cat suddenly stiffened. 1 second, the animal was calm beneath my hand. The next, its whole body became tense. Its head lifted sharply, and its ears turned toward the space behind me. The change was immediate enough that I stopped texting. I looked down at the cat, wondering what had caught its attention. Cats often react to small sounds that people cannot hear. It may have noticed something moving inside a wall, rainwater dripping somewhere, or a branch scraping the side of the house. The cat did not look toward a window. It did not look toward the television. It stared directly behind me. Its eyes were wide, and its body stayed completely still beneath my hand. It looked as though it had seen something. Before I could turn around, the little girl reacted too. She slowly removed the pacifier from her mouth. Then she raised one hand and pointed behind me. "Who's that?" she asked. The words immediately filled me with fear. I looked at her face, hoping she was joking or pointing at something on the television. But her eyes were not on the screen. She was staring over my shoulder. Her finger remained pointed toward the open corner behind the couch. I felt my entire body become cold. The cat and the child had reacted at almost exactly the same time. That was what made it frightening. If only the cat had looked behind me, I could have blamed an insect, noise, or shadow. If only the little girl had said something, I could have assumed she was using her imagination. But they both noticed something together. For a second, I could not make myself turn around. I imagined a stranger standing directly behind the couch. Maybe someone had entered the house without me hearing because the rain was so loud. The doors might not have been locked properly. A person could have been watching us while we focused on the movie. I also imagined something worse. A pale face, a dark figure. Something tall standing silently in the corner. My heart began beating so hard that I could hear it. I knew I had to look. If there truly was someone behind us, I needed to protect the child and get out of the house. I could not sit there pretending nothing was wrong. I turned around quickly. Nothing was there. The open corner was empty. I looked toward the nearby hallway and the parts of the room I could see from the couch. There was no person standing behind me. No one moved away or disappeared through a doorway. The shadows remained still. I stared for another second, searching for anything that could have created a human shape. There may have been furniture or coats nearby, but nothing looked like a person. Relief came for only a moment. I turned back toward the little girl. I did not want to frighten her, so I forced myself to act calm. My voice probably sounded less steady than I wanted, but I smiled and told her there was nothing there. "Don't worry," I said. "There's nobody behind me." I expected her to accept that. Children sometimes see shapes in dark rooms and forget about them quickly when an adult says everything is safe. Instead, her expression became more intense. Her eyes opened wider than I had ever seen them. She looked terrified and confused, as though she could not understand why I was denying something obvious. "No," she said. She pointed behind me again. "Look." "Who is that behind you?" The second question was much worse than the first. This time, she was not asking about an uncertain shape. She sounded sure that someone was there. Her finger remained aimed at the exact place behind my shoulder. The cat continued staring in the same direction. I turned again. The corner was still empty. I looked more carefully this time. I checked the floor, the walls, the open doorway, and the darker spaces farther back. The television light moved across the room as the movie continued, but it did not reveal anyone. There was nowhere for a person to hide without making noise. Nothing was there. Still, I felt watched. The open corner behind me now seemed impossibly dark, even though I could see that it was empty. I had the powerful feeling that if I turned back toward the television, something would appear again. I thought about switching on every light in the house. I also considered picking up the little girl and leaving immediately. But it was raining hard outside, and I had no proof of danger. Running into the storm with a 3-year-old because she pointed at an empty corner would have seemed ridiculous. I tried to stay calm. I told her again that nobody was there. I said it softly and slowly, hoping my voice would reassure both of us. She kept staring behind me. Her face looked serious in a way that did not match her age. Children sometimes make strange expressions, but this felt different. She seemed to be watching someone who was watching us. I wanted to ask her what the person looked like. The question almost came out. Then I stopped myself. I was afraid of the answer. If she described a normal person, such as her mother or father, I might have been able to explain it as imagination. But what if she described someone dead? What if she said it had no face? What if she told me it was standing directly over my shoulder? I did not want to know. The cat's reaction made it harder to dismiss. The animal's body remained rigid, and its eyes tracked something behind me. It did not hiss or run, but it was completely alert. Its ears shifted slightly, as if following movement that I could not see. I moved closer to the child. I considered taking the cat with us into another room, but I did not want to turn my back on the corner again. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The little girl lowered her hand. Her expression changed. She placed the pacifier back into her mouth and turned toward the television. She continued watching Tangled as if nothing had happened. There was no transition. One moment, she was staring past me with the widest, most frightened eyes I had ever seen. The next moment, she was calm. The cat relaxed at almost exactly the same time. Its body softened beneath my hand, and it settled back into its earlier position. Its ears returned to normal, and it stopped watching the space behind me. That sudden change disturbed me even more. It felt as if whatever they had been seeing had left. I looked over my shoulder again. Nothing. The open corner remained empty. The movie continued playing, cheerful and bright, completely disconnected from the fear I was feeling. The little girl watched without showing any sign that she remembered asking about someone behind me. I asked her carefully, "Who did you see?" She did not answer. Maybe she did not hear me because of the movie. I tried again. Who was behind me? She looked at me briefly, but seemed confused by the question. Then she returned her attention to the screen. It was as if the moment had been erased from her mind. I did not push her. I was too frightened. I checked my phone and began considering whom I could call. I did not want to contact the child's parents and tell them to rush home because their daughter had seen an invisible person. They might think I was overreacting or trying to avoid babysitting. I also did not want to remain alone in the house. Eventually, I called my mom. I tried speaking quietly so I would not scare the child. The moment I heard my mother's voice, some of the fear I had been holding inside came out. I told her what happened. I explained that the cat suddenly became tense and stared behind me. Then the girl pointed at the same place and asked who was there. I told my mother that I had checked twice and found nothing. I described the little girl's face when she insisted someone was behind me. My mother tried to calm me down. She probably said the child was imagining something or reacting to the cat. Maybe she saw the animal looking behind me and decided there must be a person there. That was possible. Children often copy the reactions of adults and animals. The cat may have heard a sound, turned its head, and caused the little girl to look in the same direction. Once she saw a shadow, her imagination could have created a person. But their reactions seemed too perfectly timed. The cat stiffened at the same moment the child removed her pacifier. Neither one looked at the other first. They both looked behind me as though something had entered the room. My mother stayed on the phone for a while, which helped. I turned on more lights and kept the little girl close to me. I moved to a position where my back was against the wall instead of facing the open corner. I did not care whether that looked strange. I needed to see the whole room. The child continued watching the movie and behaved normally for the rest of the night. The cat also seemed fine. No doors opened, no objects moved. I did not hear footsteps or voices. Nothing else happened. When the parents returned, I considered telling them. I cannot remember whether I explained the whole story that night. I may have mentioned that their daughter said she saw someone, or I may have kept it to myself because I did not want to sound frightened. If I did tell them, they probably treated it like a normal childhood moment. A 3-year-old seeing an imaginary person is not unusual. Young children invent friends, speak to empty rooms, and describe things adults cannot see. Their minds are still learning the difference between imagination, dreams, memories, and reality. There was no reason for the parents to assume anything supernatural had happened. But I had been there. I saw the cat react. I saw the child's face. Even now, that is what stays with me most. She did not look playful. She did not smile or laugh. She looked confused that I could not see the person standing behind me. The second time she asked, her voice carried urgency. No. Look. It sounded as if something was getting closer or becoming more obvious. I have tried to think of every normal explanation. The television could have created a moving shadow behind me. Because Tangled is a bright animated movie, changing colors and figures would have been reflected around the room. The child may have seen a human-like shape appear on the wall. The cat could also have noticed the moving light. But the girl did not point at a wall. She pointed into the open space behind me. Maybe lightning flashed through a window, creating a temporary silhouette. The storm was strong enough for that to happen. A tree or object outside could have cast a shadow that looked like a person. But I do not remember lightning at that moment, and the little girl continued seeing someone after I turned around. Perhaps there was an insect near the ceiling. Cats often become completely focused on tiny bugs. The child may have followed the cat's gaze and mistaken the insect for something larger. But she said who, not what. She believed she was looking at a person. Maybe someone was outside a window or reflected in a dark surface. The child could have seen a neighbor or passerby behind me from her angle. Yet we were inside, late at night during heavy rain. I checked the area and saw no one. Another possibility is that she had been thinking about a scene from the movie. At 3 years old, imagination can mix easily with reality. She might have believed a character was standing in the room. That explanation is probably the most reasonable. The cat's reaction may have been unrelated. Two strange things can happen at the same time without being connected. Still, the exact timing has always bothered me. The cat stiffened. The girl removed her pacifier. Both looked over my shoulder. Then, after several frightening seconds, both returned to normal at once. It felt less like imagination and more like something entered the room, stood behind me, and then left. I often wonder what the girl saw. Did she see a man or woman? Was the person someone she knew? Did it look friendly? Her first question sounded curious. Her second sounded frightened. Maybe the figure changed as she watched it. Perhaps it moved closer to me. I also wonder how close it was. When she pointed, her finger was aimed directly behind my body. The couch was positioned so that someone could have stood only a few feet away. What if a figure had been leaning over me? The cat may have been looking at its face. The child may have seen it clearly. I never felt a touch, breath, or movement. I only felt the fear created by their reactions. That may have been enough. There is something uniquely frightening about being told that someone is behind you. Human beings cannot see the space at their backs, so we are forced to trust other people who can. When both a child and an animal react to the same empty space, it becomes very difficult to ignore. If an adult had played a joke, I might have accused them of trying to scare me. A 3-year-old and a cat were not planning anything together. They had no reason to create the same reaction. I have sometimes wondered whether children and animals can see things adults cannot. Many cultures believe young children remain more open to spirits because they have not yet learned to reject what does not fit normal reality. Animals may notice movement, sound, or energy outside human senses. I do not know whether that is true. There are scientific explanations for most strange behavior. Children misunderstand shadows, and animals hear frequencies we cannot. Their senses are different, but that does not mean they see ghosts. Still, that night made me understand why people believe it. The little girl was certain. The cat was certain. I was the only one who could not see what stood behind me. For a long time afterward, I hated sitting with my back toward an open room. Even in my own home, I preferred couches and chairs against walls. If a cat or dog suddenly looked past me, I immediately turned around. The memory came back whenever someone's eyes shifted toward the space behind my shoulder. Usually, there was nothing there. There had been nothing visible that night either. That did not make it feel empty. I still picture the room during the storm. The rain is striking the windows. Tangled is playing on the television. I am sitting on the couch, petting the relaxed cat, and texting my friends. Then, the cat's body becomes stiff beneath my hand. The little girl removes the pacifier from her mouth. Both of them slowly look behind me. "Who's that?" she asks. I turn around and see nothing. I tell her not to worry. Then her eyes widen, and she points again. "No, look. Who is that behind you?" I never found out. A few seconds later, whatever they had been watching seemed to disappear. The child returned to her movie. The cat relaxed. I called my mother because I was too frightened to sit there alone. Maybe it was only a shadow from the television. Maybe it was lightning, imagination, or an animal sound hidden beneath the storm. But I still think about how they both reacted at exactly the same moment. And I still wonder what stood behind me that only they were able to see.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
This happened when I was living in a shared flat. And even now, I do not know whether what followed was caused by a person, something supernatural, or a series of strange events that only seemed connected. At the time, I tried to explain everything logically. I did not want to become the kind of person who panicked over noises, open doors, or things that might have simple causes. But by the end of that week, I no longer cared what the explanation was. I only knew I did not feel safe there, and I never stayed another night. The first strange moment happened while I was walking home. I was already close to the flat when I noticed a man farther behind me on the path. He was walking in the same direction I was, but he was too far away for me to see his face or any clear details. I could only tell that he was an adult man moving at a normal pace. At first, I did not think anything of it. People walk in the same direction all the time, especially near homes and apartment buildings. There was no reason to assume he was following me. He was not running, calling out, or trying to catch up. Still, one detail felt slightly unusual. There was almost nothing else down that path. The route mainly led toward the building where my flat was located. It was not a busy street with several shops, side roads, or public buildings. Someone walking that way was probably going to the same area. I looked back only once or twice. The man remained far enough behind that I could not tell whether he was watching me. He may not even have noticed me. I reached the flat, went inside, and closed the door. Because he had been so far away, I did not wait near a window to see where he went. I did not check whether he entered the building or turned somewhere else. At the time, he seemed unimportant. Later, I wished I had paid more attention. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep. I always locked it. The room had a simple lock that used a single key, and I kept that key inside with me. No one else should have been able to enter while I was sleeping unless they forced the lock. Living with flatmates means sharing kitchens, bathrooms, hallways, and common areas with other people. Even when you trust the people around you, having a lock on your bedroom gives you privacy. My room was the one space that belonged only to me. I went to bed expecting a normal night. At exactly 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly. There was a loud sound in the room. My first impression was that someone had picked up one of my pillows and thrown it across the floor. It was not simply a soft movement beside the bed. The sound had weight and direction. Something seemed to strike another part of the room before landing. I sat up quickly and tried to understand what had happened. The room was dark, and for a few seconds, I could see only the shapes of furniture. I listened for movement near the door or footsteps outside. There was nothing. I switched on a light and checked the room. Nothing appeared obviously wrong. The door was still locked. The key was where I had left it. No one was under the bed, inside the closet, or standing in a corner. One of the pillows may have been on the floor, but because I had been sleeping, I could not be completely certain where it had been before I woke. I could have pushed it away while turning in my sleep. People move objects without realizing it at night. A pillow can slide from a bed and make a surprisingly loud sound when it lands. That was the explanation I accepted. I placed everything back where it belonged, checked the lock again, and returned to bed. The next night, it happened again. I woke at 3 in the morning to the same kind of sound. It again seemed like a pillow had been thrown across the room. This time, I became more alert immediately. I sat up and looked around, expecting to catch something moving. The room was empty. The door remained locked. I checked the time. 3 o'clock. I began feeling uncomfortable, but I still told myself it was a coincidence. Perhaps my body naturally woke around that time. Maybe a noise from the building happened every night at 3 and caused me to move suddenly in my sleep. The mind can also create a quick explanation when someone wakes from a dream. If I heard a knock from another flat, I might have believed it came from a pillow hitting the wall. I did not remember dreaming, but that did not mean I had been fully awake when I heard the sound. On the third night, I locked the room more carefully. I looked around before bed and made a mental note of where everything was. I placed the pillows properly and kept the floor clear. I wanted to know whether anything truly moved. At 3 in the morning, I woke again. The sound came from somewhere across the room. My heart started beating hard before I even opened my eyes completely. I turned on the light and checked. I still could not prove what had happened. A pillow or soft item seemed out of place, but I could not say with complete confidence that I had not moved it myself. I was asleep before every incident, and no matter how carefully I arranged the room, I could have disturbed things during the night. The event repeated for 6 consecutive nights. Every night, I woke at exactly 3. Every time, I had the same powerful impression that a pillow had been thrown across the room. I never saw it moving. I never caught anyone inside. I never found the door unlocked. That made the experience difficult to explain to other people. If I said someone was entering my room, they would ask how. If I said an object was moving by itself, they would ask whether I had actually watched it happen. I had not. I only woke to the sound. By the 4th and 5th nights, I began dreading 3 in the morning. I would lie in bed, wondering whether I should stay awake and watch the room. I tried to keep my eyes open, but eventually exhaustion took over. Then the sound would wake me. I considered setting up a camera, but I did not have a proper one ready, and at the time, I still believed the explanation would turn out to be something ordinary. Perhaps a flatmate left for work at 3 and shut a door loudly. Maybe pipes inside the walls made a sudden knocking sound. A boiler or heating system could switch on at the same time every night. The building might have had a scheduled machine or pump that created vibration. Those explanations made more sense than a person entering a locked bedroom only to throw a pillow. Still, the sound seemed to come from inside the room. I began checking the lock multiple times before sleep. I pulled the door after turning the key to make sure it was secure. I kept the key near me. Sometimes I placed a small object by the door so I would know if it opened. Nothing showed signs of movement. The door stayed locked every morning. After the 6th night, the strange waking stopped. The next night, I slept through 3 in the morning. Then another night passed without anything happening. A full week went by. The silence made me feel better. I began believing I had experienced a temporary sleep problem caused by stress. Once I stopped expecting the sound, it disappeared. I tried to forget the man on the path. I tried to forget the 6 nights. Nothing else happened for several days, and the flat returned to normal. Then I came home one day and found the front door open. I stopped before entering. The main door should not have been left wide open. Someone might forget to lock it, but leaving it open was different. Anyone passing could enter the building, or flat. I listened from outside. I did not hear voices or movement. Part of me wondered whether someone had broken in. I entered carefully and called out to see whether any of my flatmates were home. One of them answered. I asked why the front door had been left open. They said they had locked it after coming inside. Then they added that maybe it had not closed fully. Sometimes a door catches against the frame and looks shut, even when the latch does not engage. A small push, air movement, or vibration can make it swing open later. That explanation was possible. Old doors can be unreliable. I tried not to overreact. Nothing appeared stolen from the common areas. My flatmate seemed calm, and there was no sign of an intruder. I shrugged it off and walked toward my bedroom. My door was closed. I unlocked it using the key and pushed it open. Everything inside had changed. All of my furniture had been rotated 180 degrees. The room looked like a reversed version of itself. Large pieces that should have faced one direction now faced the opposite way. Items that had been arranged along the walls were turned around. The bed, desk, chairs, or other furniture had been shifted in a deliberate way. This was not the result of someone searching through drawers quickly. Someone had taken time to rearrange the whole room. All of my smaller belongings had been gathered and piled in the center of the floor. Clothes, personal items, objects from shelves, and anything else that could be moved had been placed together. I stood in the doorway, unable to enter. For several seconds, my mind tried to reject what I was seeing. I wondered whether I had entered the wrong room. That was impossible. It was my door, my key, and my belongings. I looked for signs that something had fallen or that furniture had been moved because of repairs. No one had told me about any work inside. My flatmates would not have rearranged everything without asking. This was far beyond a normal joke. Moving heavy furniture takes effort. It also makes noise. Whoever did it must have been inside for a long time. The front door had been found open. My bedroom had been locked. The key had remained with me. I called my flatmates and showed them the room. I asked whether they had done it. They denied it. Maybe they laughed nervously or thought someone else had played a prank. but I did not find it funny. The scene felt threatening. Someone had entered the one place I believed was secure. They had touched everything. They had changed the direction of the furniture as if they wanted me to know they had complete control over the space. Then they had piled my belongings in the middle like a warning. I checked the lock for damage. I do not remember seeing obvious signs that it had been forced. The door had opened normally with my key. A skilled person might have picked the lock. A flatmate could have copied the key. Someone might have removed or bypassed part of the door. But none of those ideas made me feel safer. I thought again about the man I saw walking behind me before the 6 nights began. Had he followed me to the building? Had he watched which flat I entered? Maybe he had found a way inside. Perhaps the noises at 3 in the morning were not dreams. What if someone had been entering my room while I slept? The thought made me feel sick. The door had always been locked, but a lock only protects you if no one else can open it. If the man had copied a key, learned how to pick the lock, or found another entrance, he could have stood inside the room while I was unconscious. The sound of the pillow may have been deliberate. Maybe he threw it to see whether I would wake. Perhaps he had been testing how deeply I slept. Each night, at exactly 3, he could have entered, made a noise, and watched my reaction. That explanation was horrifying, because it meant the strange nights were not random. They might have been preparation. When the activity stopped for a week, maybe he was waiting until I relaxed. Then he returned while I was away and rearranged the room. I searched for another way inside. I checked windows, walls, and any possible access point. I tried to determine whether someone could have climbed in from outside. Depending on the height and structure of the building, a window may have been reachable from a ledge, drain pipe, balcony, or nearby roof. Nothing obvious explained it. Even if someone entered through a window, moving all the furniture without being heard by flatmates seemed difficult. Maybe the flatmates were involved. That possibility crossed my mind, even though I had no proof. A group of people could have moved everything faster and kept the truth from me. They may have thought it was a joke. But why create such an unsettling scene? Why leave the front door open? Why deny it after seeing how frightened I was? It did not feel like a harmless prank between friends. It felt like someone wanted me to leave. Another possible explanation was that the furniture had not been turned exactly 180 degrees. Fear may have made the change seem more complete than it was. But the room was clearly rearranged. The pile in the center was real. No mistake in memory could explain that. I had left a normal bedroom and returned to a space that someone had deliberately transformed. I did not stay there that night. I did not wait to see whether the sound returned at 3 in the morning. I packed whatever I needed and left. I may have returned later during daylight with someone else to collect the rest of my things, but I never again slept in that flat. People sometimes say I should have contacted the police immediately. Perhaps I should have. An open front door and a disturbed locked room could indicate a break-in or stalking. Even if nothing had been stolen, someone entering and rearranging personal belongings is serious. At the time, I was frightened and wanted distance more than answers. I worried that the police would dismiss the event as a prank between flatmates. There were no clear fingerprints, camera footage, or witnesses that I knew about. I also feared what might happen if the person responsible learned that I had reported it. Leaving felt like the safest choice. After moving out, the 3 in the morning events stopped. I no longer woke to the sound of a pillow being thrown. I did not find doors open or rooms rearranged. That suggests the activity was connected to the flat. Whether it was caused by a person or something else, it did not follow me. For a long time, I believed a human intruder was the most likely explanation. The man on the path may have targeted me. He could have entered the flat, tested my room, and later moved everything while I was gone. The idea of a stalker fits the open front door and rearranged furniture more easily than a ghost does. But there are still problems. Why wake me at exactly 3 for 6 nights? Why throw a pillow but do nothing else? How did he enter a locked room without leaving damage? Why move heavy furniture instead of stealing valuables? A stalker might do those things to frighten someone, but the behavior was unusually controlled. The supernatural explanation is also difficult. People often connect 3 in the morning with paranormal activity. A locked room, moving objects, and furniture being turned around could sound like a haunting. But there had been a real man walking toward the flat before everything started. That detail has always made the event feel more human. Perhaps the man had nothing to do with it. He may have lived nearby or visited someone in the same building. The timing could be coincidence. My sleep problems may have been caused by stress, and the room could have been rearranged by flatmates as a cruel joke. Those are separate explanations that require no single frightening person. Still, my mind continues joining them together. A man follows the path toward the flat. That night, I wake at 3. The same thing happens for 6 nights. The activity stops. A week later, the main door is found open. My locked bedroom has been completely rearranged. It feels like a sequence. The most disturbing thought is that the furniture may have been turned while someone waited for me to come home. Maybe the person remained nearby and watched the building. Perhaps he wanted to see my reaction. If so, leaving immediately may have disappointed him. I never received a message, note, or direct threat. No one admitted responsibility. That lack of explanation is why the experience stayed with me. If a flatmate had confessed, I could have been angry and eventually moved on. If police had found an intruder, I would know who did it. If there had been visible damage to the lock, I could explain how someone entered. Instead, I was left with a room that should have been secure and evidence that someone had been inside. Sometimes I imagine the nights differently now. I picture myself sleeping while the door slowly opens. A person enters using a key or tool. He stands beside the bed and watches. Then he throws the pillow. I wake and switch on the light, but he has already slipped into the hall and locked the door again. That does not seem possible, because I checked the room immediately and found the door secured. But something woke me. Something happened at 3 for 6 nights. Maybe the sound never came from the pillow. Perhaps it came from inside the wall, ceiling, or another flat. My sleeping brain connected it to an object in the room because that was the closest explanation. If so, those nights may have had nothing to do with the later break-in. I would prefer that. It would mean no one entered while I slept. But I will never know. The image I remember most clearly is the moment I opened the bedroom door after finding the entrance to the flat open. The entire room seemed wrong. Furniture faced the opposite direction. My belongings sat in a pile in the center. It looked less like a robbery and more like a message. Nothing important needed to be taken. The purpose was to show me that the lock did not protect me. Whoever or whatever did it wanted me to understand that the room was not truly mine. I understood. I left. Some people may say I overreacted. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the flatmates knew more than they admitted. But after 6 nights of waking at exactly 3 to unexplained sounds, I was not willing to wait for another event. A room is supposed to be the place where you feel safest. Once someone enters it, touches everything, and rearranges it while the door is locked, that feeling is gone. I never stayed another night because I did not want to wake at 3 and discover that this time the person who moved the furniture had decided to stay. One morning, I woke up. because I could hear a strange buzzing sound somewhere in my bedroom. At first, it was faint enough that I thought I might still be half asleep. It sounded like a small insect flying close to the walls, circling the room, and then disappearing into a corner. I lay still for a while, hoping the sound would stop on its own. Instead, it returned every few seconds. Buzz, silence, then another short burst of movement. I sat up and looked around the room. Nothing seemed unusual. The window was closed, the curtains were hanging normally, and there were no insects flying near the ceiling. I checked around the lamp, the walls, and the furniture, but I could not see anything. I assumed it was probably a fly, mosquito, or some other small insect that had entered through a tiny opening. It was annoying, but not frightening. I got out of bed and tried to follow the sound. Each time I moved toward one part of the room, the buzzing seemed to come from somewhere else. It might sound close to the window, then suddenly seem as if it were near the ceiling. I checked behind furniture and looked around the floor, but I found nothing. Eventually, the noise stopped. I returned to whatever I had been doing and tried to forget about it. A few hours later, I heard the buzzing again. This time, it seemed louder and more focused. I listened carefully and realized it was coming from near the curtains. I walked toward the window and slowly pulled the fabric aside. A bee was sitting behind it. I felt relieved because I had finally found the source of the noise. A bee inside a bedroom is not ideal, but at least there was a normal explanation. It had probably entered through a small gap near the window and become trapped between the curtain and glass. I did not want to kill it. My plan was to open the window or scare it enough that it would fly outside. I moved the curtain and waved my hand near it. The bee did not react. I expected it to fly immediately, but it remained in exactly the same place. I waved again, this time closer. Still nothing. I tried making noise, shaking the curtain, and moving objects near the bee. It would not fly away. It did not crawl along the glass or raise its wings. It was alive because I could see small movements, but it acted weak or frozen. I wondered if it was injured. Maybe it had become trapped for too long and was exhausted. Perhaps the room was too cold, or it had hit the glass repeatedly until it no longer had the strength to move. I continued trying to guide it toward the window. Several minutes passed. Then, without warning, the bee simply fell. It dropped from behind the curtain and landed on the floor. I waited for it to move. It did not. The bee was dead. That was strange, but I still did not feel seriously frightened. Insects die inside houses all the time. It may already have been near the end of its life when I found it. The buzzing I heard earlier could have been its final attempts to escape. I decided I would clean it up later. Before I could move away from the window, another bee appeared. It landed directly against the glass or on the edge of the window. I stared at it, surprised, finding one bee inside could be an accident. Finding another immediately afterward suggested there might be an opening nearby. I tried to scare this one away, too. I waved at it and tapped near the window. The second bee did not move. It had landed only moments earlier, so it should not have been exhausted. I had watched it arrive under its own power. Its wings had been working normally. Then, almost as soon as it settled, it died. There was no long struggle. It did not buzz around the room or slowly weaken like the first one. It simply stopped moving. I stood near the window, unsure what to think. Two bees had entered or appeared near the same place, and both had died within minutes. I checked the glass, frame, and curtains for anything unusual. There was no visible chemical, spray, or sticky substance that could have harmed them. I had not used insect killer in the room. Maybe something had been applied to the outside of the building. There could have been pesticide near the window, and the bees were being poisoned when they landed. That seemed possible, although I did not smell anything and had not been told about pest control. I left the bedroom and went to eat breakfast. While I was in the kitchen, I tried to think of a normal reason for what happened. Bees sometimes become weak from cold, disease, or exposure to chemicals. Two dying near the same window might have been coincidence. The buzzing had stopped, and nothing else unusual happened while I ate. When I returned to the bedroom, I saw another dead bee on the floor. This one was different. It had been crushed. The body was flattened against the floor as if someone had stepped on it or smashed it with a heavy object. I stopped in the doorway. I knew I had not killed it. The first bee had fallen near the curtains, but it had not been crushed. The second one had died near the window. This bee was in another part of the room, and its body looked damaged by force. I was home alone. There was no other person in the apartment who could have entered my room and stepped on it. I did have pets, 2 cats and 1 dog. My first thought was that one of them might have caught the bee. Cats chase insects, and a dog might step on one accidentally. But all of my animals were small. A cat could kill a bee with its paw, but the body looked more heavily smashed than I would have expected. It did not look bitten or partly eaten. It looked as if something broad and heavy had pressed straight down on it. I checked the pets. None of them seemed interested in the room. They were not watching the floor, playing with an insect, or behaving as though they had recently caught something. I also worried that they might try to eat the dead bee and be stung or become sick. I did not want to touch it. By then, the whole situation had started to make me uneasy. There was no good reason for 3 bees to appear so quickly, and the third one looked as if someone had deliberately killed it. I placed a shoe over the body. That way, my pets could not reach it, and I would not have to look at it until I felt ready to clean it up. I tried to convince myself that one of the cats had done it. Maybe the bee had landed on the floor while I was eating, and a cat had struck it repeatedly. Small animals can create more force than people expect. The shoe would keep the body covered, and once my mother came home, I could ask her to help me check the window. I left the bedroom and went to the bathroom. I was gone only for a short time. When I came back, there was another dead bee on the floor. It was also crushed. I stared at it from the doorway. The shoe was still covering the first smashed bee. None of my pets were inside the room. The new body had appeared in another spot. I checked the floor carefully, wondering whether I had somehow overlooked it earlier. I was sure it had not been there. I had searched the area after finding the first crushed bee. The new one was obvious enough that I would have noticed. Something had killed another bee while I was in the bathroom. The apartment remained quiet. I called out even though I knew I was alone. No one answered. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. It was. I looked through the other rooms. There was no stranger hiding inside. My pets were together in another area and seemed calm. None had blood, pieces of insect, or signs that they had attacked anything. I returned to the bedroom, but did not go fully inside. The room suddenly felt different. It was the same place where I slept every night, but now I did not want to stand there alone. I kept looking at the curtains and window, waiting for another bee to appear. I listened for buzzing. At first, there was silence. Then I thought I heard something near the ceiling, a faint vibration. I could not tell whether it was another insect or only the sound of a machine somewhere in the building. I decided not to search. By that point, I was too frightened to keep investigating. Every time I entered the room, another dead bee appeared. I went into the living room and stayed there. I stood rather than sitting because I felt too nervous to relax. From where I was, I could see part of the hallway leading to my bedroom. I kept expecting a bee to fly out. I also worried that there might be a hive hidden inside the walls. If bees had built a nest near the window, they could be entering through a crack. A large group might suddenly come into the apartment. But that did not explain why they were dying. It also did not explain the crushed bodies. A hive would produce living, active bees. They might become trapped, fly around the lights, or sting someone. They would not normally appear flattened on the floor. I wondered whether there was something toxic in the room. Maybe carbon monoxide or another invisible gas was killing them. That thought frightened me even more because something dangerous enough to kill bees might also affect me and my pets. However, I felt physically normal. I was not dizzy, sick, or having trouble breathing. My animals were fine. A cleaning chemical might have spilled on the floor, but the bees were dying in different places. I had not recently treated the room with poison. The stranger possibility returned to my mind. What if someone had entered the apartment? The man or woman could be hiding somewhere, killing the insects and placing them where I would find them. But that idea made no sense either. Why would an intruder do something so strange? How could they move through the bedroom without me hearing them? The front door was locked, and there was no obvious way in through the windows. I checked the time repeatedly, waiting for my mother to return. The longer I waited, the more I thought about the first bee. It had refused to move no matter how much I tried to scare it. Then, it simply fell dead. The second bee died the moment it landed. The next two were found crushed. The events felt like a progression. First, the bees became weak. Then, they died instantly. Then something started smashing them. I knew that sounded impossible, but it was difficult not to see a pattern. I remained in the living room until my mother came home. The moment I heard her at the door, I felt relieved. I told her what happened as quickly as I could. I explained the buzzing, the bee behind the curtains, and how it fell dead. I told her about the second bee dying as soon as it landed on the window. Then I described the crushed bodies on the floor. My mother may have thought I was exaggerating at first. Bees inside an apartment are not usually a major mystery. She probably assumed there was a nest outside or a small opening in the window. I showed her the shoe covering one of them. We went toward my bedroom together. I felt safer with her beside me, although I was still nervous about what we might find. When we entered, there were more bees. Around 10 additional bodies had appeared. They were spread across the bedroom floor. Every one of them looked crushed. My mother stopped. There was no easy way to explain how so many could have appeared within such a short time. Only minutes earlier, I had seen 2 dead bees on the floor. Now, there were at least 10 more. They had not simply fallen from the ceiling and died naturally. Their bodies were damaged and flattened, as though someone had stepped on each one. The room did not show signs of any person entering. Nothing else had moved. The shoe remained over the first bee exactly where I had placed it. My belongings were undisturbed. There were no footprints, wet marks, or objects that could have fallen and crushed the insects. We looked at the pets. They were not inside the room. Even if they had entered earlier, it seemed impossible that they could have killed 10 bees so neatly and then left without making noise or showing any interest. Cats usually play with insects. They chase them, hit them, bite them, and leave the bodies in different conditions. These bees looked as if they had all been pressed down. My mother helped clean them up. I did not want to touch them. As we collected the bodies, we checked around the window, behind the curtains, beneath the furniture, and near the ceiling. We found no hive. There was no large group of living bees. There were no holes filled with insects, honey, or wax. The window frame looked normal. The room did not smell like pesticide or chemicals. We searched the rest of the apartment, too. No other bees were found. Every body had appeared inside my bedroom. That made it feel personal. even though I knew insects could not intentionally choose a room for supernatural reasons. After we cleaned everything, I kept watching the floor. I expected more bees to appear the moment we turned away. None did while my mother was there. The buzzing did not return. The room became completely quiet. Later, we asked other people in the building whether they knew about any beehives nearby. No one did. The neighbors had not noticed large numbers of bees around the windows, roof, or walls. No one else had experienced insects entering their apartment. There were no reports of dead bees in other rooms or hallways. If pest control had sprayed the building, no one seemed aware of it. That made the event harder to dismiss as an ordinary hive problem. A nest might have existed somewhere hidden, but why would only my room be affected? Why did the bees arrive and die within such a short period? Most importantly, what crushed them? I began considering whether vibrations or pressure could have damaged the bodies after they fell. Maybe they landed beneath furniture or objects that moved slightly. The cats could have stepped on some without intentionally attacking them. But 10 bodies appeared in different open areas. There was no single heavy object moving across the floor. My pets were too small to create the same flattened appearance repeatedly without me hearing them run around. I had been standing in the nearby living room. If all 3 animals had entered and chased a swarm, I would have heard something. There would have been meowing, barking, scratching, or objects being knocked over. The apartment had remained silent. Another explanation was that the bees were already dead and damaged before entering. Perhaps someone outside had crushed them, and wind carried the bodies through a gap near the window. That seemed almost impossible. Dead, crushed insects do not fly. The window was closed enough that 10 bodies could not simply blow inside without dust, leaves, or other debris. Maybe the bodies fell from inside the curtain or ceiling where they had already been trapped. But I had checked behind the curtains earlier. The first living bee had been there alone. No pile of dead insects was hidden above it. I also thought about the possibility of parasites or disease. A sick bee can behave strangely, become unable to fly, and die suddenly. An infected colony might produce many dead bees around its entrance. That could explain the first 2. It could not easily explain why the bodies looked smashed. Perhaps I misunderstood the damage. Insects become flattened naturally after falling, drying out, or being moved. Fear may have made them look more violently crushed than they really were. I try to remember that. Memory changes, especially after a frightening experience. I may now imagine the bodies as more damaged than they were. But at the time, both my mother and I could see the difference. They did not look like ordinary dead bees. It looked as if someone had killed them. The fact that they appeared only when I left the room made the event feel even stranger. I found the first crushed bee after breakfast. The second appeared while I was in the bathroom. The larger group appeared while I waited for my mother in the living room. Each time the room was left alone, more bodies appeared. Once my mother entered with me, the activity stopped. For a while afterward, I avoided being alone in the bedroom. I kept the curtains open so I could see the window clearly. I checked the floor every time I walked in. Sometimes I thought I heard buzzing, but I never found another bee. The event did not repeat. There was no second swarm, no hidden nest, and no explanation from the building management. Life returned to normal. That should have made it easy to forget. Instead, the fact that it happened only once makes it more disturbing. A normal hive problem would likely continue until the nest was removed. A gap in the window would allow more insects to enter. Pesticide would affect other bees or animals in the area. Nothing else happened. It was as if a group of bees entered my room for a few minutes, died in impossible ways, and then stopped appearing forever. I sometimes wonder whether something in the apartment was responsible. Not necessarily a ghost or spirit, but some invisible condition that existed briefly. Maybe an electrical field, gas, vibration, or chemical leak affected the bees before disappearing. Bees are sensitive to their environment. They can become confused by heat, light, scent, and electromagnetic changes. A short event might have drawn them toward the window and killed them. That would be a scientific explanation, even if I never discovered the exact cause. But I still cannot understand the crushed bodies. Sometimes I imagine that something else was in the bedroom, something I could not see. Perhaps it was catching the bees as they entered and pressing them into the floor. That thought is irrational, but it is the image the memory creates. The first bee refused to move because it was already frightened or trapped. The second died instantly. The rest were killed when I left the room. I wonder whether the bees were reacting to the same presence. Maybe they sensed something inside that humans could not. Animals and insects respond to small environmental changes before people notice them. They can detect vibrations, smells, and fields outside our senses. What if the buzzing was not caused by a bee trying to escape? What if it was warning behavior? The first insect may have been trapped behind the curtains because it was trying to hide. Then it fell dead. The idea sounds like a horror story, but nothing else explains why the bee refused to fly, even when I disturbed it. I also think about why the bodies were placed where I could see them. If the pets had killed them, that was coincidence. If something else did it, the bodies may have been a message. I do not know what the message would have meant. There was no symbol, pattern, or writing, only dead insects. Perhaps the point was simply to make me afraid of the room. It worked. For weeks, I checked the floor before stepping inside. I looked behind the curtain slowly, expecting to find another bee staring from the glass. I avoided leaving the room and returning immediately because I feared more bodies would appear. My mother tried to reassure me. She said there had to be a nest somewhere or an issue outside the building. That was the only practical explanation. We may have checked again later, but nothing was found. The neighbors continued reporting no bee problems. No one else saw unusual numbers around the property. I eventually stopped asking. People often lose interest in strange events once they stop happening. Without new evidence, there is nothing to investigate. The dead bees were thrown away. No photographs were taken. No one examined them to determine whether they had been poisoned, crushed, or infected. Now I wish we had kept one or taken pictures. An expert might have identified the cause from the bodies. They could have told us whether the damage came from pressure, a pet, disease, or something else. Instead, all I have is the memory. I remember the first buzzing sound. I remember searching the room and finding nothing. I remember pulling back the curtain hours later and seeing the bee sitting there. I remember waving at it while it refused to move. Then it fell. I remember watching the second bee land and die immediately. I remember returning from breakfast and finding the crushed body on the floor. I remember placing a shoe over it because I was afraid to touch it. Then another body appeared while I was in the bathroom. By the time my mother came home, there were around 10 more. They had appeared within minutes. No person was in the apartment. The pets were too small and had not been in the room. There was no hive. No neighbor had a similar problem. I still do not know what happened. The normal explanation is probably that bees were entering through a hidden opening and my pets killed them while I was not looking. That is what I tell myself when I want the story to make sense. But I was home. I was listening. I would have heard a swarm. I would have heard the cats chasing insects or the dog moving around. I saw how quickly the bodies appeared. It was too fast and too quiet. Sometimes I think about the room sitting empty while I waited in the living room. The door was open. The apartment was silent. No one walked inside. Yet when my mother arrived and we returned together, 10 smashed bees were waiting on the floor. I do not know what killed them. I only know that it happened when the room was left alone. My house is around 100 years old, which sounds ancient when you are young, although I suppose in the larger history of buildings, it is not unbelievably old. Still, it has always had a strange feeling to it, especially because we know a little about the first family who lived there. They were blacksmiths. Long before my family moved in, they had a forge in what is now our back garden. The forge no longer stands, but parts of it are believed to be buried beneath the grass. If you look at the garden now, there is nothing obvious to suggest that people once worked with fire, iron, hammers, and heavy tools there. It looks like an ordinary backyard. But beneath the ground are the remains of a place where people spent years striking hot metal. The house itself was very simple when the blacksmith family lived there. It did not have the furniture, decorations, or modern equipment it has today. From the old photographs, it seemed almost empty. There was a table, a stove, a few seats, and not much else. The people in the pictures looked serious. They stood inside and outside the house, wearing old clothing and facing the camera with the stiff expressions people often had in early photographs. The rooms around them looked bare, and the yard seemed much rougher than it does now. My family only had those photographs because of something unusual that happened years later. My family used to own a small chain of pubs. One day, a man entered one of them and approached my grandfather. He handed him an envelope filled with old pictures of our house and the family who first lived there. The blacksmith family had already moved out around 20 years before the man delivered the envelope. No one knew who he was. My grandfather did not recognize him, and as far as we know, he did not explain why he had the photographs or why he wanted our family to have them. The stranger simply delivered the envelope and left. When we looked through the pictures, no one in the family could identify him among the people shown. He did not appear to be a member of the blacksmith family. At least, he did not match any of the faces in the photographs. That detail always made the history of the house feel less like ordinary local information and more like something that had been deliberately passed to us. Why would a stranger keep photographs of another family's house for 20 years? How did he know my grandfather was connected to the property? Why did he decide to bring the pictures to one of our pubs instead of contacting us normally? No one ever found out. The photographs remained with the family, and over time, they became part of the house's story. I grew up knowing that the building had once belonged to blacksmiths, and that the buried forge still existed somewhere beneath the grass. I sometimes imagined what the property would have looked like back then. There would have been smoke rising from the yard. The sound of metal being struck would have traveled through the house. Heavy footsteps would have moved between the rooms and the forge. Chairs would have scraped across the bare floor. Pots, tools, and pieces of iron would have been handled every day. I did not always think the house was haunted. Most of the time, it was simply home. My family lived there, our dogs moved through the rooms, and the usual sounds of daily life made the building feel normal. But strange things did happen. The downstairs bathroom was one of the places where people often felt uncomfortable. If you went inside and closed the door, you might hear footsteps outside. The sound was not always loud. Sometimes it was only a few steps moving through the hall and stopping near the bathroom door. At first, you would assume a family member was outside. You might call their name or wait for them to knock. Then you would open the door and find the hallway empty. This happened often enough that several members of my family knew about it. It was not a story told by only one person. Someone would be using the bathroom, hear footsteps approach, and expect another person to be waiting outside. But no one would be there. We also heard chairs moving. A chair would scrape across the floor in another room, even when no one was sitting there. Sometimes the sound came from downstairs while everyone was upstairs. Other times, someone would hear furniture shifting nearby and walk into the room to find everything in its usual place. Because the house was old, it was easy to blame the noises on normal causes. Old floorboards move, wood expands and contracts, pipes knock, dogs bump into furniture. Sound travels in strange ways through old buildings. Those explanations were usually enough. Even if the footsteps outside the bathroom seemed too clear or the moving chairs sounded too deliberate, nothing truly frightening happened. At least, not until a few months ago. That night, I was home alone. My brother was staying at his girlfriend's house, and my parents had gone to visit friends. I knew they would not return for a while, so I had the whole place to myself. Normally, I did not mind being alone. The house could make strange noises, but I had lived there long enough to recognize most of them. A creak in the hallway or a knock from the pipes was nothing new. I had the dogs nearby, which also made me feel safer. If someone approached the house, they would react. If an animal moved in the yard, they would bark or become alert. I settled down and started watching a YouTube video. I do not remember what the video was about. It was probably something ordinary, and I was focused enough that the rest of the house faded into the background. Then, I heard a loud bang downstairs. I stopped the video. For a second, I remained completely still and listened. The sound had not been a small creak or a normal house noise. It was heavy, as if something large had fallen in the kitchen. I told myself the dogs had caused it. Maybe they were trying to get through a door. Perhaps one of them had bumped into something or knocked an object from a low surface. That explanation made sense, but something about the sound felt wrong. It seemed too loud. It also sounded as though several things had moved, not just one. I waited for the dogs to bark. I do not remember hearing them react in a way that matched the noise. That made me more nervous. I paused the video and stood up. The house had become quiet again. I called out to the dogs. They did not come running immediately. I started walking toward the stairs, trying to convince myself there was nothing to fear. I repeated the normal explanations in my head. The dogs had knocked something over. A cupboard door had opened. A stack of pans had fallen. The house was old. I was only frightened because I knew I was alone. Still, as I approached the downstairs area, I could feel that something was wrong. The kitchen lights were on. I did not remember leaving them that way. More importantly, the lights in the backyard were also on. The yard glowed beyond the windows, showing parts of the grass and the area where the buried forge was believed to be. I stopped. I knew I had not switched those lights on. At first, I thought my parents might have returned without me hearing them. Maybe they had entered through another door and were somewhere downstairs. I called out. No one answered. Then, I saw the kitchen. All of the pots and pans that had been stored inside a cupboard were scattered across the room. Some were lying on the floor. Others had landed farther away. A few appeared to have struck cabinets or walls before falling. The cupboard was open. It looked as though someone had reached inside, grabbed everything, and thrown it around the kitchen. This was not one pan slipping from a shelf. The entire cupboard had been emptied violently. I stood at the edge of the room, too frightened to move closer. The first thought that came to me was that someone had broken into the house. A burglar could have entered, searched the cupboards, and turned on the lights while moving through the property. I immediately began listening for footsteps or breathing. The kitchen seemed empty. No one stood near the back door. No figure moved outside beneath the yard lights. I looked toward the dogs, expecting them to be barking at an intruder. They were not attacking anyone. If a stranger had entered through the front or back door, the dogs should have made enough noise for me to hear from upstairs. Then I checked the locks. The house had 3 locks on the door. It also had a heavy-duty security chain. The chain was especially noticeable because it rattled loudly whenever the door opened. Even if someone had a key for the locks, they could not open the door fully while the chain remained attached from inside. All 3 locks were still in place. The chain was still connected. No one had entered through that door. I checked for damage. There were no broken locks, splintered wood, or signs that someone had forced their way inside. The windows were closed. Nothing obvious had been broken. A burglar would have needed to enter without opening the chain door, avoid alerting the dogs, throw every pot and pan across the kitchen, switch on the backyard lights, and then disappear without leaving through any visible exit. That did not make sense. I looked outside. The yard lights illuminated the grass and parts of the garden. The old forge was somewhere beneath that ground. I could not see anyone near the house. The garden was empty. Still, the lights made the yard feel occupied. It was as if someone had switched them on because they wanted me to look outside. I stayed near the doorway, trying to decide what to do. I considered calling my parents immediately. Another part of me wanted to search the house first. That would have been a terrible idea if a real intruder was hiding there, but fear can make people behave strangely. I wanted proof that no one was inside. I did not want my parents to return and discover that I had panicked over something the dogs had done. I picked up something I could use for protection. I do not remember exactly what it was. It may have been a heavy object from nearby. Then I began checking the downstairs rooms. The living room was empty. The bathroom door was open. The hallway contained no one. I looked behind doors and toward any place where a person could hide. Nothing moved. The house remained silent except for the faint sounds of the dogs and the electrical hum of the lights. I checked the back door again. The chain had not been disturbed. I looked at the kitchen floor. The pots and pans had landed in different positions, as though thrown rather than dropped. Some were upside down. Others were several feet from the cupboard. For all of them to fall naturally, the shelves would have needed to collapse or tilt. The shelves were still intact. The cupboard itself did not appear damaged. Even if the dogs somehow opened the cupboard, they could not have lifted metal cookware and thrown it across the room. They might knock one item down while searching for food, but not empty an entire cabinet in that way. The backyard lights also remained unexplained. The switches were inside. Someone or something had activated them. I turned them off. For a moment, the windows became black again. I immediately regretted it. With the yard dark, I could no longer see whether anything stood outside. I switched them back on. Nothing was there. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They believed me. That may sound surprising, but they had experienced enough strange noises in the house to know I was not simply trying to scare them. They also knew I would not throw our cookware around and invent a story about it. My family understood the house had a history. They knew about the footsteps outside the bathroom. They had heard chairs move when no one was near them. The incident in the kitchen was much more extreme, but it did not happen in a place that had always felt completely normal. While waiting for someone to return, I stayed away from the kitchen. I kept the dogs close. I did not go upstairs again because I wanted to remain near the exits. At the same time, I did not want to stand near the back door or look into the garden. The buried forge kept entering my thoughts. The first family had worked with metal. Pots and pans were metal. I wondered whether the objects had been chosen for a reason. Perhaps the sound of the cookware crashing through the kitchen was connected to the old blacksmiths somehow. That idea was probably created by fear, but once it entered my mind, I could not remove it. I imagined the house when it was nearly empty. A table, a stove, a few seats, the blacksmith family moving through the rooms. Outside, the forge burned. Hammers struck metal for hours. Then, decades later, the house changed. New rooms were filled with furniture. The forge was buried under grass. The original family disappeared from the property. Maybe something had remained. The mysterious photographs suddenly felt more important, too. A stranger had delivered them to my grandfather 20 years after the blacksmith family moved away. No one knew who he was. He did not appear in the pictures. What if he had been connected to the house in another way? Maybe he knew something about the property. Perhaps the photographs were not only historical records. They might have been a warning. Of course, there's no evidence for that. The man could have been a collector, local historian, or distant relative who simply wanted the pictures returned to the house's current owners. He may not have explained himself because he was in a hurry or believed the images spoke for themselves. But no one ever identified him. That mystery has always stayed with us. When my family returned, we inspected the kitchen together. The locks were still secure. The chain was still attached. No window was open. Nothing had been stolen. Only the pots and pans had been disturbed, and the lights had been switched on. We cleaned the kitchen and returned everything to the cupboard. While doing so, we checked the shelves for damage. There was no clear reason for the objects to have fallen. We considered whether a vibration had knocked them down, a heavy vehicle passing nearby, construction work, or a small earthquake could move objects inside an old house. But the cupboard door would still have needed to open. The yard lights would not switch on because of vibration. No one else reported feeling movement. Another explanation was that the dogs caused it. Maybe they chased something into the kitchen and struck the cupboard. But the dogs were not large enough to create that kind of destruction without knocking over other things. They also could not turn on the lights unless one somehow hit a switch by accident. Even if that happened, there were too many separate events to explain. The normal explanations required several coincidences. The cupboard opened. Every pot and pan fell. The lights switched on. The dogs remained strangely quiet. The locked house contained no intruder. All of it happened while I was upstairs alone. After that night, I stopped staying home by myself. I could no longer sit upstairs and ignore noises from below. Every bang made me think of the kitchen. Every chair scraping across the floor made me wonder whether something was moving furniture again. The footsteps outside the bathroom became much harder to dismiss, too. Before, they were only strange sounds. After the kitchen incident, they felt like evidence that something moved through the house when we could not see it. I became especially uncomfortable using the downstairs bathroom alone. If I heard steps outside, I waited before opening the door. Sometimes the footsteps stopped directly on the other side. There would be no knock, no voice, only silence. Then I would open the door and find the hallway empty. I started calling out first. If a family member answered, I felt relief. If no one answered, I stayed inside longer than necessary. The chairs continued moving occasionally. Sometimes the sound came from the kitchen or living room at night. A slow scrape, a pause, then another movement. When we checked, nothing appeared different. Those incidents never reached the same level as the night the pots and pans were thrown, but they kept the memory alive. I have tried to decide whether the house is truly haunted. Part of me believes there must be a logical explanation. Old houses can create powerful sounds. Animals can enter walls. Locks can appear secure when another access point exists. Electrical faults can switch lights on. Shelves can fail. A single event involving several ordinary problems may feel supernatural only because it happens at the same time. Maybe the cupboard door had not been closed properly. The shelf may have shifted, causing the cookware to fall. One of the dogs could have bumped the light switch. The backyard lights might have been left on earlier without me remembering. That is possible. But I remember the condition of the kitchen. The cookware looked thrown. It was spread too widely. The shelves had not collapsed. The cupboard remained attached. I also remember the fear before I understood what happened. The bang did not sound accidental. It sounded violent. It sounded as though someone had entered the kitchen and swept everything out in anger. Sometimes I wonder whether the activity was connected to me being alone. The house knew the usual pattern of people moving through it. That night, my brother was gone. My parents were away. Only I remained. Maybe the silence allowed normal house sounds to seem louder. Or maybe whatever was there understood that no one else could witness what happened. The fact that my family believed me helped, but it also made the experience more frightening. If they had laughed, I might eventually have convinced myself I overreacted. Instead, they connected it to the footsteps and moving chairs. They knew something strange happened there. They just did not know what. We never dug up the buried forge. Part of me is curious about what remains beneath the grass. There could be old bricks, tools, iron pieces, ash, or objects left by the first family. Maybe there are items that should have been removed long ago. Another part of me believes disturbing the site would be a mistake. The forge has been buried for decades. Whatever history remains there may be better left alone. The photographs are still proof that the first family existed and worked on the property. Their faces remain frozen in those old images. Sometimes I study the backgrounds. I look for shapes in windows, doorways, or shadows behind the people. I wonder whether the unknown man who delivered the envelope knew one of them. Maybe he had inherited the photographs. Maybe he found them somewhere and recognized the house. Or perhaps he wanted us to know exactly who had lived there before us. No one in my family has ever found an answer. The house is still our home. During the day, it feels normal. The garden looks peaceful. The buried forge gives no sign of being there. The kitchen cupboards remain closed, but at night, the old sounds return. Footsteps outside the bathroom, furniture shifting in empty rooms, a scrape across the floor. Sometimes I imagine the first blacksmith family moving through the bare house. One person walks down the hall. Another pulls a chair from the table. Someone goes outside toward the forge. Metal strikes metal in the garden. Maybe the house remembers those sounds. Maybe old buildings hold movements the way photographs hold faces. Perhaps nothing intelligent is haunting us. It could be only the past repeating itself. But that explanation does not account for the lights. It does not explain the locks. It does not explain the kitchen. Something opened the cupboard and scattered every pot and pan while I sat upstairs. Something switched on the backyard lights, illuminating the ground where the old forge was buried. I do not know whether it wanted my attention. If it did, it succeeded. I still live with the memory of that night. I no longer stay home alone because I know how quickly the house can change. One moment, I was watching a video and telling myself I was safe. The next, metal crashed through the kitchen below me. I went downstairs expecting to find the dogs. Instead, I found the room destroyed, the garden lit, and every lock still secured from the inside. Nothing had entered. Nothing had left. But something had been there.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people. Real nights. And none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.